Okay, let's go ahead and get started. A little bit over, but I think Alan will get us back on time, so shouldn't be a problem. Before I introduce our next speaker, I'll just let you know, because as soon as Alan's finished, we'll actually break for lunch, and lunch is actually going to be outside. You might have noticed when you're walking a big white tent. Everything will be out there, and it's actually a beautiful day, so I figured it's a really nice way to sort of break from being, in the cave here. So we'll go outside and enjoy a really nice lunch. So as soon as Alan's done with his presentation and answering questions, no pressure, we'll break for that. So our next speaker is Alan Krupnick. He's a senior fellow and director at the Center for Energy Economics and Policy at Resources for the Future. He's actually been involved in, I guess, numerous touch points with Sloan Foundation, looking at different aspects of shale, and he's going to talk about one in particular related to the risks and regulations around pits and tanks. So, Alan?
Thank you.
Sure.
So I want to start out thanking Ken for putting this whole effort together. It's great. I was talking to some folks here about RFF should really have an office in Houston. We come here a lot, but we miss all of this. It's really great. So I wanted to start out recognizing that we have a long history with the Sloan Foundation. I want to start out talking about sort of the first round of some of the work we did. Some of you have heard of it, some of you may not have. So just so you know, people who don't know us, we are a kind of a think tank, a research group, we're non-advocacy, we publish in academic journals, and then our main audience, unlike a university, which is students, acts as policymakers. So the first round of research funded by the Sloan Foundation had to do with an expert survey that we did, and I'm going to talk a little about that here because the work that we're doing now on pits and tanks kind of follows from that. But then we also did some work on state regulations, where the main finding there, we have all these maps, and you're going to see some more maps today that go deeper into this particular topic. The tremendous heterogeneity of state regulations on shale gas development. Some of that is, we tried to explain some of that heterogeneity, and we had a very hard time doing it. So it's kind of this unexplained variability. It could be just historical development, but it makes you wonder how much of that is really necessary or optimal. We don't have answers to that question, but we pose it. Then we did some statistical analyses to look at the risks. This first round was all about risks and regulations. So one study that we did, and all this work is either published or in the process of being published in journals, was on the surface water quality linkages to shale gas development in Pennsylvania. And so it was a very detailed statistical analysis to look at well activity over space and over time in the Marcellus, and Pennsylvania's part of the Marcellus, and look at the effect that had on stream quality as measured by all of the monitors that are in Pennsylvania to monitor stream quality. And the bottom line on that was that there was no systematic effect we could find of spills at well sites reaching the stream. So that's a good news story for the industry. But there was evidence of runoff from all this development reaching the stream. So we saw higher levels of suspended solids in streams. And there was also evidence that the waste that was being shipped to waste treatment plants was having an effect on stream quality in terms of chlorides, which both are a problem in their own right, since it's salt in fresh water, and also as a marker for whatever's coming up in the produced water. And then the last two more things that we did. One was in accidents. So truck accidents in the Marcellus, and again in Pennsylvania, we linked truck accidents that related to shale gas development. And what we see there is, as you would expect with a new industrial activity that involves a lot of truck traffic, we saw elevated accident rates and injuries and deaths. And then the final thing that we did was a survey, and you'll hear about a survey later today that folks from Colorado have done. This is a different kind of survey, a survey of people in Pennsylvania and Texas, a random sample of people in those two states, asking them for their degree of support for shale gas development in their state, and also their willingness to pay to see those risks of shale gas development reduced. And then we also did a little fancy footwork on them where we had 3 different ways of describing the risks to people, divided into 3 groups at random. One way was taken directly from the American Petroleum Institute website. So basically, trust us, we've been doing this for a long time, we know what we're doing, don't worry. The second, I'm very technical. The second was from a composite of NGO websites. And there it was very anecdotal, folksy, and there's other characteristics, but anyway. And then we wrote, and then we wrote one that we termed the rational middle. So we tried to say on the one hand, on the other, basically like that. And the bottom line of that was that the industry script was, so we gave support at the beginning of the survey. We gave them the script, and then we rechecked their support for shale gas development. And the bottom line there was that the people who got the industry script were just as likely to be more opposed to development than they were before. So that's not good. The people who got the NGO script were by and large more opposed to development than they were before. And the people who got our script were kind of in the middle of those two. So it's a story about the difficulties of communicating what the industry feels is a relative lack of environmental risk to the general public.
Alan, you said the industry script more opposed, the NGO script more opposed,
the industry script
more
was,
opposed?
well, the industry script people were just as likely to be more opposed as more supportive. So you would hope, the industry would hope that it would be symmetric with the NGOs. So on the one hand, people that got the industry script would be more likely to become more supportive. People that get the NGO script would be more likely to become more opposed. But it's asymmetric.
But the question is, did any script make them not more opposed?
No.
Well, it was equal on the industry script. So it was like 50-50. And a lot of people, of course, didn't change their mind. About half the sample doesn't change their mind. So I didn't want to dwell on that, but just to let you, there's a sort of a history here of work. So the outline of my presentation, our second round of work has to do with what we call taking a deeper dive on pits and tanks. So we start with this Pathways to Dialogue survey of experts I mentioned, and I'll talk about that briefly. And then we want to look at the wastewater characteristics that are being put into these pits and tanks, because if they're leaking or leaching or volatilizing, we want to know what is in there. And this is the most data-intensive study on this that we're aware of. And this is currently at a journal for a review. So you'll be one of the first to see that. Then we looked at risk, costs of mitigation, benefits of mitigation, industry practices, and regulations associated with this piece of shale gas development activities. And finally, we made some recommendations, so I'll end with them. So a couple of years ago now, we did this survey. Maybe I should just do it this way so I don't have to turn around. Where we asked 215 experts from these 4 groups to identify their priority risk pathways, we call them, and there were 264 of them. and then 14 additional, what we call accident pathways. There was a surprisingly high degree of consensus about this. What were the highest priority pathways? I'm afraid I'll put this in my eye, but no. Okay. Of the top 20, these circles, these oblongs represent each of the 4 groups. Of the top 20 vote getters in each group, 12 of those were held in common by all 4 groups. So a surprising degree of consensus among experts about what the problems really are. And of that, this is a list of just a couple of them, but the one that came out was this one here with on-site pit pond storage, flowback produced water, fracking fluids, and impacting surface water and groundwater. So this is a key part. So we wanted to do that kind of a study on that particularly. So that's how we got to this point. And also we had talked to some regulators and they liked that as well. And then just to be more specific about it, so this is a flow chart we developed. We're not going to go through all this, obviously, but just to show you what we've actually looked at. So here's from the well. The liquid comes up from the well. It can go to a pit. It can go to the tank. It can go from a pit to a tank. So we kind of looked at that. And then it could overflow. It could leach. It could run off. It could volatilize. So we looked at that, and we didn't get into too much detail over here, and we didn't look at any of the recycling and treatment parts of this chart. So it's limited. But one would really want to. The next phase would be to kind of look at this area in here, where there's so much reuse going on. So let me move to this characteristics of the water, of the liquid that's coming up from the well. So it turns out that there are this form in Pennsylvania, 26R, that have to be submitted by generators of a significant amount of waste and for a chemical assay. So what we did, we were able to get those forms. They're submitted on a kind of a well pad basis once a year. So this data are not very detailed. They're not very time detailed. They're not very spatial detailed, but this is the best that's available, and we collected everything we could get our hands on from 2008 to 2011. And so here, these are the results, some of the results that are interesting. So let me go through this a little bit. So these are box plots. So the middle, the box is ranging from the 25th to 75th percentile. There are 2 sets of box plots on each graph. It can be two-handed here. So there's these kinds. That's fracking fluids, and then this is produced water. In practice, you can't separate these very easily. There's no reason that the frac fluid should have such high levels of chloride. There's produced water that's in there. The companies classified these themselves, and there's really no check on this kind of a thing. So you have to take that with a grain of salt, but you can look at these all. You can look at these all together. The mind works in strange ways. I didn't try to do that. Okay, so then these horizontal lines, these are various types of standards. So you see here the Pennsylvania effluent standard of 250 milligrams per liter. So that's the way the charts work. So this is for chlorides or TDS, and this is a good way of looking at salts. I mean, after all, this downhole liquid is ocean water. So it's 3 to 4 times as salty as actual ocean water today, about 30,000 or so in oceans, and up here, this is a log scale. Remember that, log scale. So this is These are high levels, 80,000, 90,000 on average. So that's one kind of result. And then there's heavy metals. So barium looks like it's way above the standards. Now, this is a good time to just stop and think about this for a second. This liquid is never supposed to see the light of day. It's not supposed to get into the environment. So the fact that it's 40 times the MCL, that's the drinking water standard, is not necessarily, I mean, we shouldn't be alarmed by that at all, because it's not supposed to be drunk. But if it does get into the environment, and the effluent standard is a little bit more indicative of that, it's a bit higher, it can do bad things if it's in sufficient concentrations. So it's just a marker on what potential risks are out there. So barium, pretty high levels. Strontium, pretty high levels in this Pennsylvania water. Chromium's actually below, the bulk of it is below the MCL, so that's a good story. Cadmium, pretty low here. When we don't have the box plots, it means there's so many missing values in the data that we just don't feel confident laying out percentiles, and we just give ranges. So for the organics, benzene, again, this is a log scale, so this upper level here, that's a lot more than the MCL. Some waste streams have a lot of benzene in them. Toluene, the bulk of that is below even the MCL. So that's kind of, there's good story, bad stories here on the distribution. And finally, the norms, the naturally occurring organics, radioactive materials, and they're quite a bit higher than MCLs. We haven't looked at the implications of this in terms of risk. That's a very difficult problem. So, but that's what's kind of getting put into the pits and the tanks. So findings, these are pretty high concentrations in some places. There's a lot of variability across wells. This could be a challenge for effective treatment and management. There is differences between the composition in produced water and flowback, but again, because you can't really classify cleanly, I wouldn't talk about that too much. And it'd be nice to go a little further here, because waste treatment plants, where some of this waste gets sent, others are deep injected, others stay in the pit if it's buried. Some can be treated, others cannot very well. So that's probably our most quantitative new work. Then now I want to talk specifically about this project that we have. It's with the Environmental Defense Fund. Project goals are to improve understanding of a variety of issues around pits and tanks. We're kind of doing the research part of it, and EDF is mostly responsible for taking this research into the policy dialogue process with stakeholders, including regulators. And I'm not going to talk about any of that today, and that's an ongoing, I'd say, embryonic process there. So I'll just go through some of these elements. So there are actually, in terms of the risks, there are actually no rigorous studies out there that quantify the risks you might get from pits or tanks. The risk of failure, then the risks of the movement of the material, then who and what is going to be exposed to this, and then what that does to them. That is not, you're not going to find that. Some of the studies that are out there are actually for RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act studies that were done in the 70s and 80s. There's really not appropriate for looking at this sort of thing, but that's where there's some data. These studies do identify major categories of contaminants and the release mechanisms, which I've kind of already mentioned, so I'm not going to dwell on them at all. And these substances, if they are in sufficient quantity and you or wildlife get exposed to them, can do damage. There's no question about that. But whether they're in sufficient quantity or not, that's an issue. So in fact, we did find a bit of data from 3 states, New Mexico, Colorado, and Oklahoma, these are reported spills and releases. So we could compare a little bit reported spills from pits and tanks. So again, let's see, I think on the next slide I have a picture of a pit and a tank. So you'll see that if you don't know what they look like. The problem with this graph, which shows that there's a lot more, over time, there's been a lot more spills out of pits than tanks, is we don't know the denominator. What's the fraction of spills from these? And I asked my Yusuke, who's got the lead on this, about that, and we're not able to find that data. And that's a problem. That's a problem in the reporting of data like this. So researchers like us and like many others around the country who want to look at these things can actually do analyses. So if these data aren't available, that's a major issue. So here's, though, what we know something about the spills, at least. So in Mexico, New Mexico, where a lot of the spills are from overflow and liner malfunction in pits, and in frac tanks, it's about the leaks. So my favorite is vandalism. So the problem is that hunters come by or people with guns come by and they shoot at the tanks. That's pretty amazing. From Washington, D.C., this kind of stuff doesn't happen that often, although we have had our White House fence jumpers, and maybe that's kind of similar. I don't know. Anyway, humans are capable of all sorts of crazy stuff. So costs and benefits. So risk mitigation options. There's a lot of options to reduce the risks associated with pits, including where you put them and how deep, how big it is, and liners you put in there, and the types of material, its thickness, its permeability. Freeboard, the distance between the sort of the maximum fill level and the ground, the surface. The types of leak detection systems you're using, fencing, netting, and screening so wildlife or wandering drunk people don't get in there. How you close, the closure and reclamation requirements, and so on. And as tanks, whether you're closed loop handling systems, really closed loop, or you're just using mobile frac tanks. We looked at estimates of a lot of different cost estimates. So I'm not going to dwell on these. These are kind of boring. The bottom line here and then we looked at the benefits of mitigation options. So we do find that multiple barriers appear to reduce the risks of wastewater leakage from the pits. So you've got this liner there. If you have multiple liners, obviously that's going to reduce it's going to reduce permeability. But these are very old studies. The way the liners are installed is just as important as the characteristics of the liners themselves, how permeable they are. And I should tell you, when we went into this topic, our going in assumption was that the industry should use tanks, mobile tanks. These are metal tanks above ground. They can move the material off site. It just seemed could be part of a closed loop system. It just seems so much better than worrying about the weather and the pits leaching and volatilization and all of these issues. But the more we got into it, the more we saw that that tanks may not be the answer in all places. And I think the industry feels very strongly about that some places pits make a lot more sense. In fact, when we look at costs of mitigation options, we actually found some examples of studies that said it was cheaper to actually have the tanks. So these are an example of the tanks here. Than it was to have the pits and deal with all the issues associated with pits. But these are back of the envelope older studies, and new ones are needed. But I think the bottom line here is there's no one solution that fits all cases. And then our partner EDF did this, which is comparing some of the advantages and disadvantages of pits and tanks. So an X is a good thing here. So pits are not going to catastrophically fail where tanks could. They could fall over. One of the issues here, in addition to vandalism with tanks, is tornadoes. So your tanks could be vulnerable to tornadoes where the pits are, I suppose, could be vulnerable, but not as vulnerable. And leak detection, much better in tanks. So, you know, you can array the advantages and disadvantages, and these have costs associated with them. This is still a study that's in progress. We also asked industry. There was a little survey we did of the independent petroleum producers, asking them how they looked at some of these issues. And it was kind of what you would think. I mean, they're taking a lot of factors into account to decide how they want to handle their waste, their liquid waste. They're trying to balance many factors. I mean, everything that was in there that you would expect to be in there, that should be in there, I would say. But there was this proximity to hunters and tornadoes that some mentioned. And one thing that they said, it was interesting, is they often go beyond the letter of the law in terms of what they do. So they may not have to use tanks, but if a state says the state says you can use pits or tanks, but they might use tanks anyway, incurring additional expense. And then the best practice, again, varied what they thought was best practice in tanks, not the obvious choice. And the desirable role for regulators, not surprisingly, the companies want to see performance standards that account for risk differences, not prescriptive command and control regulation. And in the maps I'm going to show you next, you'll see how that lines up, and in some of our recommendations. So let me go to that now. So this is basically a continuation of our work on the state regulations, where we develop all these different maps and look at how the states vary in how they regulate these things. So we surveyed regulations in 19 states that were some of the largest producers, 28 different regulatory elements, and I'm not going to go through every map here. I just want to show you, I want to talk about a couple of them. So this one is kind of the pain in the butt story here, because states classify these pits in so many different ways. So it's a little hard to line up the states, because some states, like you can see, Texas has 21 different pit types that they classify, where Pennsylvania has one. And so when you're trying to compare them, it's difficult. We used some of the classifications from Stronger to try to sort our way through this. Permit requirements for pits. This one's kind of interesting because of Colorado. So you can see here in the blue are the states where a permit's required for all pit types. So no matter what you're storing in these pits, a permit is required for it in those blue states, where a permit is not required in the black states there. But Colorado's interesting because they do something that economists like me would like, which is they say we only need a permit if you're going to store hazardous material in there, hydrocarbons that are above a certain threshold of concentration. So that's a nice way of trying to reduce permit costs while for the companies, while trying to be protective of the environment. But as you see, Colorado is the only state that's doing that. This is another one. So you would think, I don't know, it would seem you would want to never have a pit in a flood zone. That just seems like a really bad idea. Now it depends on how frequently the flood is. I mean, if it's a 1,000-year flood zone, maybe it's okay. But I don't know what the definition here is, but I'm sure it's not 1,000 years. Probably 20 or 10. Anyway, pits are forbidden in flood zone in 6 states, the dark blues. And then in some states, they try to cut that up a little bit in the light blue states where some pit types are prohibited and some aren't. So the ones that are going to be storing what might be more hazardous material, they might fall into that category. Then in one state, pits are allowed in flood zones, but forbidden near water features. So that's a puzzle a little bit to me, because how would the flood occur if you're not near a water feature? I don't know. I'm sure Nathan Richardson, who is responsible for most of this, he could answer that question. So you can see, and then there's North Dakota is really interesting again, thinking about performance standards versus command and control. That is, command and control is forbid, don't forbid. Performance standard here is saying, you can put the pit anywhere you want, but you have to certify to us that it's not going to pose a hazard to water bodies. So that gives the companies a lot more flexibility, but does require a bit more from the regulatory agency. So that's why you don't see a lot of performance standards around. And then, I can go, on and on with this stuff, whether liners are required and the type of liner and liner thickness. You can see that varies across states in ways that you just wonder, why is that? Colorado and Wyoming, why is one 9, the other 24? Hydraulic conductivity, actually states that have adopted mostly 7, if they've adopted that. Putting up screens and fences, there's a lot of heterogeneity there. Days to close the pit after the drilling is completed, how many days you have a year. This varies all over the map. Inspection monitoring requirements vary a lot. Can you leave the pit the contents of the pit in place to be buried after closure? So most states allow you to do that in the states we looked at. Then there's remediation requirements, though. Even states that allow something to be left in there, you still have remediation requirements. And then what we've done, when this is all ready to be put out into the world, we've kind of aggregated this information by state. So each state can see so people can see what each state is doing in one place. You're not supposed to be able to read that, just to know that we've got those that kind of information all by state. So the last thing I want to say is about recommendations that sort of come out of this work, and we're not finished on this score, but for what it's worth. So we do think performance-based standards are better than command and control generally. So we have examples where the states can either say you have to use a particular conductivity or permeability. That's more of a performance standards, as opposed to saying you have to use liner with this thickness and this type of material. So we kind of like permeability is closer to a performance standard. And that we like that because it's more likely to encourage innovation and adoption. As I've shown you some of the maps, we think it's a good idea to have these requirements, whatever they are, kind of vary by what you're storing. So lower compliance costs, you can do that by reducing requirements for lower risk fluids. Third, from a regulatory perspective, it might be good to identify regulatory elements that involve relatively homogeneous costs across producers, like fencing and netting. So that's easier, simple to enforce. The siting of pits. So again, you want to have really strict requirements for siting in areas that are very vulnerable, like around parks, shallow aquifers, and other types of areas. But maybe you don't need stringent regulations around just your ordinary landscape. 5, so we've really focused a little bit more in this project on the pits side, but what you want is the states to develop, if they don't already have them, integrated regulations that cut across the options, all the options for handling the fluids, so that the companies are able to make decisions on the entire system of waste handling, liquid waste handling and solid waste handling for that matter, that are least cost for them but meet your environmental standards, your environmental requirements. So that's the idea there. And again, I alluded to this in my earlier remarks, there's got to be better reporting requirements. The states are all over the place on requirements. Generally, there's too little data available to do good analysis. This is a real problem we always run into. And then there's not good research out there. A lot of it having to do with the lack of data. So we need to have that done. So that is my remarks. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to ask the first question because you made a comment, Alan, a couple times that there's no clear path as to which is the optimal use of storage, either tanks or pits. You didn't really talk about why. I was wondering if you guys have looked at that at all.
Well, I think I've tried to say that there are advantages and disadvantages, both to the companies and to the environment, of different types of systems in different places and under different conditions. So, that tornado story we heard from companies, they really don't want to put above ground fluid storage in Tornado Alley, for instance. That's what we've heard. So, and then there are cost differences that vary depending on what the needs are of the companies. So, so environmental risks are different and vary spatially, and the costs differ.
How much of the cost differences are attributable to different regulatory environments in different states?
That's a good question. In fact, I'd love for you guys to answer that question. For you guys here in the UT effort, you notice that in that effort there are these costs of drilling, $3 million, $7 million, $10 million. I'd love to know how much of that is regulatory driven, and then we could begin to piece that apart. That's a hard thing to figure out, I think. I haven't seen anyone do it.
So, Alan, you mentioned there's a lot of heterogeneity across states, but there also seems to be a lot of heterogeneity within states. So some states are actually stronger than what you might think as an average regulation. And sometimes even stronger in areas that might even be more expensive or more difficult to implement. In some states, while at the same time they're weaker in other. What's the reason behind that? Are there different regulatory bodies within states? Is it that there are particular geographies and industrial structures that make some areas, some issues much more pertinent in some locations than others?
So we tried, in the first round of work, we tried to use a statistical analysis with all the data that we collected, not on these maps, but on our broader maps that many of you have seen. We tried to do a statistical analysis on that data to get some insight into answering that. And again, it's very difficult to do. And I should say, when we make these presentations around the US, or in particular to places, I just recently did the maps with the Netherlands Ministry of Energy. And everybody wants to know, well, what are the best states? Mexico in particular asked this question of us. Well, what are the best states that we should copy that have the best regulations? And what you have to say is, well, a state could have a very strict regulation, but they don't enforce it as well as some other state that has a weaker regulation that really has very tight enforcement. And then, as you're saying, Evan, the underlying costs can be different depending on where you are of meeting given regulatory, the identical goal. So it's a very complicated puzzle to sort out, and I don't think anybody's done that I know of. Not us.
Hurricane Sandy happened a year ago. Did you get any leverage on that? There were at least 20, 25 counties in Pennsylvania in the eastern part where the Marcellus play would be. Did you ever see any evidence of damage from the hurricanes? I'm thinking actually of spillage and overflows.
Well, there was a big case of spillage in, I think it was Colorado, right? Yeah, so this stuff can happen.
No, but I mean Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah. Well, I don't know specifically about
Okay.
it.
I mean,
but
you didn't look at any instances.
we didn't look at it. It's kind of an incident analysis. I think it's quite logical that this can happen, sure. Although, yeah, it could happen, yeah.
The last question is, so if you have variation within the state in enforcement, you have a natural experiment here, right? Because you've got this hurricane that doesn't necessarily know where different types of operations are occurring. And if I remember right, there are various streams and rivers in that area.
Yeah.
And FEMA has some very detailed data. I've actually seen data on that where they were doing, FEMA was coming in doing remediation on wastewater, spillage problems.
Well, let's talk about that after. That sounds like a good idea. It really does, yeah.
Have you talked with BLM, Land Management on their, any report on them, or Bureau of Indian Affairs, any of their kind of stuff where they regulate their land?
Right. So we have a paper on the BLM's latest round of proposed regulations and compare the BLM regulations to the state regulations. And BLM, if you're an environmental community person, you're not going to like that comparison. BLM's came out, some people here probably know this, they came out with fairly tight regulations in certain directions in the first proposal. And then subsequently, there was a lot of negative comments about this, and they weakened the regulations in a certain area. So now when we compare BLM to regulations for specific regulations with what the states are doing, they're not the least common denominator, but they're not leading in stringency. Let's put it that way. Now, I'm not making a comment on whether they should be leading or shouldn't be, or their lands are somehow different and it's appropriate to be less stringent, but they are on the less stringent side for regulations where stringency can actually be measured.
Yeah, I'm interested in the difference between performance-based and command and control, as you put it. Is there a trend among states? Is there a leaning among the participants from industry? What about from the environmental sector? It just seems that I can see advantages and disadvantages from each of their respective perspectives between performance-based and command and control.
Oh, on those issues, yeah.
Yeah, on those issues.
Sure, that's right. I mean, traditionally, this is a much broader context kind of comes to my mind. So traditionally, I've been around doing this for about 30 years, doing environmental instrument design and tradable permits and carbon taxes and command and control and comparing those two things. This is what economists like me do. And traditionally, the environmental community has been very much on the command and control side, where economists more concerned about cost and efficiency are on the performance standard side. Then with the success of SO2 trading among electric utilities, tremendous success of that program, a lot of the environmental community got on board to incentive-based, more performance-based regulation, major shift over. And particularly groups like EDF, who you'll hear from this afternoon, they were big on, very supportive of tradable, very flexible programs. So I think it's a mixed bag now, but there's still, certainly among the further out environmental community, I think pretty reflexively supports command and control approaches.
Along the same lines, I would just think, I like performance-based, but I would just think that given that you have multiple operators in the region and you're measuring surface water and groundwater, who do you pin it on? I mean, if you're, who you hold accountable for that.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because it wasn't part of my talk, but it's something that we've done a lot of work on, and we have a paper on this. So you can use you don't have to use regulatory tools directly. You can use the liability system, which is, sort of the standard system, right? There's some harm done, and then you get sued. And Pennsylvania has this, I think there's one other state, maybe Ohio, that more recently did this. They used that's the liability system to say to the companies, look, unless you drill water wells to test the water before you go in and drill your gas well, unless you do that, if there does subsequently turn out to be pollution of drinking water wells after you've drilled, without this pre-drilling testing, then you're going to be presumed liable in a court. And reportedly, I haven't seen the data on it, but reportedly that's led to a lot of pre-water testing. So that's a great, if this is true, then that's a great use of the liability system to turn the whole system around, and you don't even need to go through regulatory.
North Carolina's doing that, but there's been no drilling.
Yeah, and I can't even find where there would be on that map. But that's a whole other story.
One
One
last
more?
question up there.
Yeah, in the back.
I'm interested in just what your research has showed with the companies moving towards closed-loop recycling systems to try to preserve their water. How does your research take into account the shift towards more closed-loop recycling operations?
Yeah, it doesn't. Again, getting that kind of data, we haven't found a database that would allow us to document that shift. We hear about that shift. And of course, it makes a lot of sense. I think I put up that slide about advantages and disadvantages. There are a lot of advantages in going towards that closed loop system, because it takes, if it's properly set up and monitored and so on, it is going to reduce risks. Volatilization alone would be a big issue, and then wildlife, you don't have to worry about that. There's those advantages I put up there of a tank system. So some companies are going to that because it just reduces their regulatory risk. It makes sense from that perspective.
All right. Well, thank you, Alan. We're going to cut it there and break for lunch. Again, we'll meet outside the tent. Please make your way out there.